So, good morning, everybody. Thanks for getting up that early just to join me in that session today. My name is Oliver, and I'm going to guide you through the next 1 hour on day 2 of TechEd. This session is about Agile Custom ABAP Development. So, guaranteed no HANA included in this session. So, if you're getting used to HANA, you've got the whole day for filling your brain with HANA. So today, this is about ABAP development. And I'm working at a customer site. So I'm employed at DB Systel, which is the IT service provider for Deutsche Bahn. And we were the first ones to use a tool set for development of custom applications on the ABAP platform for the first time. So what I will present to you now is why I think it's a good idea to have a look at that tool set if you're going for your custom development. So I will not explain how the tools and frameworks and all that stuff which is included in detail works. You're free to ask me afterwards, because I'm a developer, so I'm happy to explain all about that. But actually, this session shall just give you an overview and when and why to look at it, and not how it in detail works. But in the end, I've put some resources into the speaker notes so that you can connect to the SCN or find the proper resources where you get much more information or get in touch with the developers or me or other people using that set already. About the speaker notes, by the way, my slides don't have too much text on the slides, but I've basically put everything what I'm going to say into the speaker notes so you can read that afterwards, so there's no need of pinning that down, actually. And I will go through the first slides quite quickly, because if we have a look at the agenda, I want to introduce you a bit to the project I'm working in and the process and technological environment we're working in, so that you can get an idea which release we're on, how the process actually looks like. Because when we talk about agile development, we can't just talk about tech, but we also have to talk about processes. But I will go through those slides quite quickly so that we can get to how to use the tool set which is provided actually quite quickly. At least I hope that. If you've got any questions, I think we've got some 15 minutes in the end. So let me briefly introduce you to our project, because it's all about custom development in this session now. So we're building an application from scratch, and whenever you build an application from scratch on ABAP platform, you actually have to think, hey, there's the whole business suite, there are so many processes, why do you actually have to go for doing some custom development? And the reason why we do that at Deutsche Bahn is quite obvious. There are not too many companies with a 50 billion euro business which aims at running some 32,000 trains on some 34,000 kilometers of tracks. So this is quite a unique business. And also, those tracks are the reason why the project I'm working in is established. So you can see here some machine maintaining a track that involves a lot of material. Okay, and while the maintenance of those tracks, the actual maintenance process, that one is managed in one of the largest plant maintenance systems which exist around the globe, the purchasing of those goods which you need for maintaining that is quite tricky. The reason is simple. The goods which are involved there, like ballast, Schotter for the Germans, sleepers, Schwellen. So this is not something you can order on Amazon and get it shipping included, but this is something which has a huge transport cost. So when Deutsche Bahn is purchasing those goods, it always needs to have a look at how much transport cost do I need to invest in order to get the material to the construction site. And the cost for the transport highly depends on the locations of the construction site and the supplier, and finding the best combination of suppliers and material suppliers and transport suppliers. This is actually what is the aim of the project I'm working on. And since all the processes involve a lot of material, and since material management is a well-known component on the SAP platform, there's a tight integration towards material management. So it was decided to go for a custom development on the ABAP platform instead of going to Java or whatever, HANA XS. Okay, so let's have a look at the project facts so that you can get an idea of how big is actually that project, where did I make those experiences. We've been developing for about 14 months now. It's been a bit enlarged, the development time frame, with in average 10 full-time developers. We're in a global sourcing with an Indian partner due to budget restrictions, of course. And you can guess that it's not an epic project, but it's also not a small one. So it's actually highly parallelized work. And why we went for some agile approach doing that was also that we wanted to be more sure, more certain about what we get right from the beginning. But that was not so easy. So now you've got a short impression on how the project is actually scoped, or what is the purpose of why we are doing custom development. So let's have a short glimpse at the boundary conditions which were set to us from a technical and from a process perspective. You may have seen that on one of the previous slides. I have put the waterfall model as a tag. Actually, our customer has told us, you are using a waterfall model. So we were not able to really go for a purely agile development. But what we did is, after we got the input from the functional specification, which was, of course, complete from a functional side, we started off with iterating during the phases of design and implementation and testing. So the process is that the consultants, which have written the functional specification, actually represent the customer. And they introduce the new requirements to the development team each 3 weeks. So cycles about 3 weeks long. And there they introduce quickly what they expect to see. Then the development team makes small chunks of whatever has been specified, starts with designing and implementing that, and the consultants as, let's say, as the interface to the customer, does a testing each iteration and verifies that whatever has been specified is implemented as they expected it to be. Or it's not, they don't verify that it's implemented the way they expected it to be, but that it works as they expected it to be. Okay, so this is about how it actually works. After the last iteration, there are the classical 3 phases of module testing, integration testing, and acceptance testing. So even for that, we did not have the ability to integrate that all into our iterations because the customer insisted on having a waterfall model approach, at least on the paper. Okay, so one small word towards the team, because also the team matters a lot when you go for agile development. So our team was spread across 2 locations, but apart from that, the team was quite homogeneous. So most of the developers were at about my age, and they were all quite enthusiastic to learn something new, which is also important if you go for a new technology. This is the buzzword for the next slide, technology. Let's have a look into the box, what is in there provided by SAP. So right from the beginning, we got a package from SAP with which they actually develop their brand new applications on ABAP, not on HANA, but on the classical ABAP platform. Just like SAP Transportation Management is also using the same stack. And this tool set consists majorly of 3 tools which have their different purposes. One is, let me just introduce them very quickly. One is the so-called BOPF, the Business Objects Processing Framework. This is a tool made for implementing business logic. Then you may know the Floorplan Manager for Web Dynpro ABAP, FPM, which is there for implementing user interfaces and harmonizing the interaction with the user. And there is a small but very useful integration layer between the 2 of them, which is called the FBI. I wish they would have called it NSA, but actually it's FBI, the Floorplan Manager BOPF integration. Okay, so this is a tool set which we were the first ones to use outside SAP, but it has been used inside SAP for many years now, except the FBI, but the BOPF and the FPM, they have been used quite long. And why we went for that actually is these are technical components, and when you go for implementing a brand new application from scratch, that involves a lot of technical services. So starting from the persistency, buffering, controlling the transaction, binding it to the UI, harmonizing the user round trip, all that you have to take care of yourself. And when you do that particularly in an agile way, this can be very disruptive. So whenever you are changing your technology layers, and you do that iteratively, you might invalidate a lot of what you have delivered in the previous iterations. So therefore, what we expected from using those tools was not only a lower total cost of development and total cost of ownership, but also a higher stability, particularly during the early phases of development. And this is particularly why we thought of, hey, let's go for an iterative approach. We've got a tool set which aims at stabilizing the technology, or which is telling us that it's stable for the technology. First question I'm usually asked, particularly by seniors, is what does it cost? This is one of the best news. It's for free if you own a business suite license. So the Floorplan Manager is part of the NetWeaver. The BOPF and the FBI, they are part of the Business Suite Foundation layer. So whenever you've got a business suite license, you are allowed to use those tools. Although they have been in the Business Suite Foundation for quite a long time, they have been released only with ECC 6, Enhancement Package 6, or NetWeaver 731. So if you're on a previous level, sorry for that, but I even managed to convince my internal customer to upgrade their system from 7.0 to 731 because of the benefits we expected from using the toolset, which is actually about money. So, as I said, those components are quite established inside SAP. So BOPF and Floorplan Manager, they've got a maturity of more than 7 years. And it's also not very likely that SAP is discontinuing the support for them, because transportation management and other components like environment, health, and safety, they also use those components. So although there's a lot of HANA buzz around, you can be sure that if you go for developing with those components, that it will not happen that SAP discontinues the support for that. Okay, the rest of that presentation now is dedicated towards those three components: Floorplan Manager BOPF integration, and the BOPF. And I would like to introduce you a bit to the responsibilities and the services which each layer offers, and what the development team actually had to do in order to leverage those benefits. Actually, I'm a developer, so I would go much more into the details, actually, but I've got only some 40 minutes, so this is a very rough overview. But as I said, get in touch with me after that presentation or on SCN, and we can clarify the details. Okay. I think I thought when preparing that presentation, just like we as a development team did not jump into the deepest depths of the technology right from the beginning, I don't want to do that in this session as well, but I want to do that iteratively. So this more or less corresponds to the iterations which we had in our custom development. And the first three iterations had the aims of, in the first iteration, showing some basic interaction with an object. So just having create, read, update, delete on a human usable UI ready. In iteration 2, we added logic. I love that term business logic because there's nothing more illogic than business logic, but in iteration 2, we added business logic. And in iteration 3, we implemented some UI-specific behavior, which in fact exists, we can't deny it. And we included some SAP reusables. So this will serve as the agenda for the next 30 minutes. So let's have a look at the first iteration. The first iteration was actually about translating business documents into a model in the system. And that includes reading this functional specification, which in the best case has something like a domain model description in it. So typically design starts with building technical representations of your entities. So you start designing classes, function groups, function modules, whatever you think, database table structures. And this is quite technical when it comes to ABAP right from the beginning, because there's hardly anything like a domain model in classical ABAP. But with BOPF, this is a bit different now. BOPF introduces something which is called a business object model into the system. So the approach is to model from outside to inside. So a business object represents an object of the real world, just like you find it in your UML diagram, more or less. And this has a very low representational gap between the reality and what is there finally in the system. So there is a sub-UI-based modeling environment in which you can model that, so you don't have to do that in a text editor. So I always love design documents because they are usually obsolete after the first change. In this case, with BOPF, you do that in your development system, so the truth about how everything is modeled is in the system. And if you want to, you can export it as some Word design document from the modeling environment in order to satisfy your quality management. Let's have a look at what BOPF offers after you have modeled your business. So let's assume you have translated that beautiful Excel spreadsheet into a model, just like you have done it in an object-oriented way. So after you have done that, BOPF directly offers generic interaction patterns with the models. This is a so-called service layer pattern. So you interact with all the objects via the same interface. This does not only include the classical CRUD services like create, read, update, and delete, but also includes some other services which are meant for discovery of instances and decoupling the UI. I will not go into the details now, but with BOPF you can implement all the logic which you need, also the changeability and readability of attributes. You can implement that in your backend with backend entities. And in addition to that, you've got a transaction management, which is provided out of the box, which takes care of locking and consistent saving of the entities which are involved in that transaction. And all those services are provided without writing a single line of code. So once you have modeled your object, modeled your structures, and activated that in the modeling environment, you can already start using it. So no code involved, which is quite strange for a developer at first, but BOPF provides a test tool, a generic test tool, with which you can operate directly on those instances and then gaze at the results in the database afterwards. So right from the beginning, you can interact with your objects, even though not with a very human-readable UI or human-usable UI, but with a generic test UI in the sub-UI. Well, actually, this is brilliant, I think. Personally, I'm very fond of that. But it's not what a user is really happy about. Okay? So even in an iterative development, you can't tell your customer, please use this generic test tool in order to verify whether your requirements have been fulfilled. So therefore, also in iteration 1, we started off to model user interfaces. Because the toolset allows to translate the entities which you've got there in your model or to bind them to screen elements. So in order to understand how that in general works, it is important to know a bit how the Floorplan Manager works. Anyone has been using the Floorplan Manager for Web Dynpro ABAP? Ah, great. Thank you. So the Floorplan Manager for Web Dynpro ABAP, for the others, consists of so-called UI building blocks, which are basically elements on your UI like forms, lists, And those forms and lists, they are interconnected via wires. And each of the UI building blocks has a so-called feeder, which provides the data into the UI element and processes the actions which are executed on that UI element, like hitting the Enter key, pressing a button, or something like that. For all that, a feeder is responsible. And this is where the Floorplan Manager BOPF integration comes into the picture. The FBI offers a lot, but the Floorplan Manager BOPF integration offers a generic set of feeders which bind to the model. So with just configuration, also without any code involved, you are able to configure the delivered feeders provided by FBI to bind to your models. So you can see in that screenshot that the upper part binds to the root node of our model. The root node is just like a domain class. And another part of the UI connects to another node. And they are interconnected with a wire, which is basically executing the association which exists there in the model between the entities. Okay? And all that happens without writing a single line of code as well. And even without doing that, just by configuring it, you are also able to have a full running transaction, including lock handling, transaction handling, edit mode handling, data loss protection, and much more, which we did not value in iteration 1. And actually, what you can see there on the screen was what we had one part of what we had delivered after iteration 1. So there was no logic involved, but it was a human-usable UI where the customer, the consultants, could enter the data, verify whether we have understood the basic setup, and we could check on the database level whether everything works as we expected it to. So let's have a look at what was the feedback during the review after iteration 1. So within the first, or after the first iteration, there was actually only positive feedback by the developers. You can see this is a developer. He knows the binary for all of those who did not calculate in the morning properly. So this is the developer, the consultants, and the project lead alike. So all of them were quite happy about the results because everybody has seen that we have made huge progress. Actually, some functional consultants, they asked us, hey, what do you need the rest of the year for? But we had not added any logic. But it was just great to see that after iteration 1, we had a human-usable UI, and we did not have any mock-ups, but real applications. So even though there was no logic involved, you could interact with the objects, and it felt quite comfortable or very comfortable for the consultants to verify the requirements. In addition to that, we had a semantic model. So we had not entities like tables or classes in our system, but we had the objects in our system, which had a very positive effect on transparency and understandability of our whole application. So as a developer, you were talking about the same entity as the functional guy did. For example, we have an entity which is called request folder, which has the demands of a construction site with which to supply the construction site. And both the developers and the consultants alike were talking about demands in the request folder. So you use that in your daily language. So understandability was particularly something which was important to those responsible for the development, because we knew we were talking about the same things. And this all resulted in a high motivation after the first iteration. After the first iteration, everybody was enthusiastic about having presentable results and having immediate feedback, because immediate feedback and validation of requirements is actually what makes you happy as a developer and as a user alike. And that we did not have to build any of those technological layers upfront just enabled a kickstart into the development. Because usually during the first iterations, if you start developing technology, you don't see anything running in your system. You don't see any business, you don't see any UIs. But with the technological layers provided by SAP, we could just get right into implementing something that could be used by the end user. And everybody was enthusiastic about BOPF, but only the developers knew that BOPF is only a part in that game. So the Floorplan Manager and the Floorplan Manager BOPF integration pay to that as well. Okay, so let's move on to iteration 2, where we have added dynamic behavior, meaning logic. And I want to introduce you also to the programming model and how BOPF enables developers to modularize in a semantical way. Because when some customer decides to invest into some SAP-based custom development, CRUD is hardly what you are happy about. Then you could stick to your Excel sheets as well. So this is going to be much more technical now. I hope most of you are developers, because we're at TechEd. Okay, so we have to, in iteration 2, we had to interact with the objects, programming to them. So we'll have a look at the consumption of business logic first. We speak of consumption of BOPF, or consumption of business logic, when we think of interacting with an object from the outside. This is usually the user interface, but it could also be a report, and it can also be accessing another business object from some application logic. So although the UI was the major consumer, we use those interfaces for consuming the business logic as well. Was that? I think that was may have been a bit quick. So one word for that. When we speak of consuming business logic, the major consumer usually is the UI. Okay? And the UI is generically implemented by the Floorplan Manager BOPF integration. So you could think, hey, why do we actually need that? Why do we need to care about consuming of business logic after all? But also the same patterns which apply for consuming business logic later on apply for providing business logic. Therefore, let me briefly explain to you how to talk to a business object. So all the interaction with any business object happens via the same ABAP interfaces. So there is one ABAP interface with which you can instruct a service manager to talk to a business object. And all this programming follows the command pattern. If anyone knows the command pattern? Ah, great. Some hands, thanks for interacting. So whenever you talk to the service manager, you have to tell him the entity which you address. So you don't have a generated class for each instance, but for each entity, but you have a service manager with which you talk in order to read an instance, for example. So there is a read method in the interface of that manager with which you can pass the entity which you want to read. This also means that the interfaces are generic. So the data which is transported in those interfaces is typed in a generic way. So this is a bit tricky to implement. And all of those interfaces are mass-enabled. So they, in theory, deal all with, or from an interface perspective, all deal with multiple instances. And they address instances via globally unique identifiers. And you may now think, hey, why is that guy all telling us that? This is just important to see that BOPF expects developers to think about quite some architectural principles which are good to adhere to, but may not be common to all of you. So, but finally, where's our business logic? This is when we look at the provisioning side. Also, while implementing business logic with BOPF, the BOPF itself remained a black box. So we know that it somehow manages buffer and database, but the actual implementation of logic happens in the implementation of interfaces which are defined by BOPF. And BOPF differentiates between majorly 3 different types of application logic. One is the so-called determination, which is a side effect of something happening when you interact with an object in a changing way. An action is something you trigger explicitly as a consumer. So both the determination and the action, they modify the state of your application. while a validation is a check which just prevents the execution of some other thing in the system. So what you can see here is that BOPF modularizes semantically. So when implementing, you have to decide, am I implementing some checking logic or am I implementing some modifying logic? Is that modification triggered explicitly or implicitly? So by providing those different interfaces, BOPF enforces developers to think semantically and to modularize semantically. And each of those entities offers another set of configuration when it is going to be executed. So for example, you can think of a determination being executed either after the modification has been taken place or only on save. So for all that, BOPF offers a set of configuration which can be entered into the modeling environment, and then BOPF executes that logic whenever it has been configured to be executed. Okay, so these were the techie slides. I hope you got over that a bit. Let's see how that integrates into the deliverables we had after iteration 1. So this is the state we had left after iteration 1, and now we have added business logic. And actually, you can see that here on the left-hand side, we had added some logic in the modeling environment. We have added some determinations, validations, and actions, which implement parts of our business logic. But those entities are actually only reflected indirectly on the UI. So determinations and validations, they actually only appear by the messages they create. Don't have a look at the messages text, though. This is a screenshot from development phase, so they are not fully appropriate. But what you can see also, there is a button on the UI, which is bound to an action. This is submit for checking. We had bound in this sample to the UI. So let me just briefly showcase how that actually works throughout the whole stack, so that you get an impression when is which part of that tool set taking care of what. So let's have that example of a user pushing that button. So the user clicks the button, and the Floorplan Manager receives that event that a button has been clicked and passes it on to the feeder. The feeder, as you may recall, is implemented by the Floorplan Manager BOPF integration, and it knows, hey, by clicking that button, I should execute the action submit for checking in our model. So it executes the action, and then BOPF knows, or BOPF checks, is there some validation configured to prevent the execution of that action? And it finds a class which is implementing that validation interface. Then it triggers the validation, which in this example creates messages and prevents the execution of that action. So the BOPF passes those messages on to the Floorplan Manager BOPF integration. The Floorplan Manager BOPF integration interprets that content, translates it into the message box of FPM, or translates it into the message format of FPM, and the Floorplan Manager puts it into a message box so that the messages appear on the UI. And for all that, no code is involved except the validating logic. So for that whole technical round trip, we as development team did not have to take care. So in iteration 2, apart from implementing that business logic, we also added enhancements to our models. But this was also very, very less disruptive, because as you may remember, all of that was bound to the model. So when we added a new node into our models, and we added a new UIBB to the Floorplan Manager application, we just had to interconnect that via associations, and all the rest was taken care of generically. So it was very easy to enhance the model structurally. Let's have a look at what the development team thought about after iteration 2. And actually, well, the developers' heads were quite heated because it was really brainy to code to the interfaces at first. So therefore, for the developers, it was really tricky to implement logic at first, because the burden a service layer brings with the generic interfaces, which are mass-enabled and which are using GUIDs, this is kind of an unusual pattern for ABAP developers. So you first have to get into the programming model. But once you have done that, it plays off to all the strengths of some generic interface. Because you only have to learn one interface, and afterwards you can understand almost every part of the application. You only have to learn it once. This is tricky, but after you have learned that, you can apply it to every part of your application. And having the model in the system just allows you to understand how your application works easily, even without being the owner of that particular component. Apart from the brainy challenges, more or less, everybody was very happy about the results, because what we had seen was that we can adapt quickly to new requirements, that we can incrementally add business logic and incrementally improve our models. Actually, after iteration 2, we really saw that the application architecture enables us to go for an iterative approach, because we could have those atomic enhancements, and with that less code involved in the whole development, it's so much more easy to change. Because if you've got code, change is quite tricky. You have to get rid of all your compiler errors. And with the configuration, it's just much more quickly, and the Floorplan Manager and the adaptability of the UI did the rest to also enable quick adaptations of the user interface. So that's it for iteration 2. We had a running application with basic business logic. And actually afterwards, more or less everything which I have told to you now applies to all the rest of the iterations as well. But in iteration 3, we were actually confronted with something that is worth mentioning here as well, because SAP does not only provide this business logic layer and the Floorplan Manager, but it also provides components which kind of bridge gaps which are usually there in custom development. Up to now, I have always stated that the Floorplan Manager was bound via the Floorplan Manager BOPF integration to the BOPF and was directly bound to the model. But honestly, this is not particularly true, because with respect to programming, there is good sense to adhere to some normalization principles. So when you're implementing business logic, you're usually not composing the business objects just like they appear on the screen. So in your business logic, you usually have some normalization, while the user expects to see everything which is relevant for his business on one screen. So you have to do some denormalization or some adaptation of your services of the backend. And actually, the good news is that also for that, there is something which is provided as part of the Floorplan Manager BOPF integration, as part of the FBI. And this is the so-called FBI view. This is a configuration object which kind of encapsulates the business objects and allows to model some denormalization or to model some kind of mappings from technical representations in the backend to human, usable, friendly entities in the front end. For example, mapping a timestamp. So in your backend, in your models, you want to capture a time point, so you should use a timestamp. But a timestamp is not very friendly for a user to use on the UI. So the Floorplan Manager BOPF integration with the FBI view provides a possibility to declare a mapping that a timestamp is going to be translated into this date field, this time field, and this time zone field. So this all can be done in a declarative way. And even much more, which I would be happy to explain to you afterwards. And even if all this declarative mapping is not enough, then the Floorplan Manager BOPF integration offers exits, which are defined via interfaces which allow you to implement some really UI-specific logic, such as raising confirmation dialogues with dynamic texts or whatever you've got there as really UI-specific behavior. Okay, so with this integration layer in between, we were actually able to adapt the UI exactly to the needs of our users. One totally separate thing of that is that in iteration 3, we were actually confronted with not being an island. Okay, so we started with integrate with the business suite via the standard APIs, BAPIs, But also we had to integrate to some NetWeaver components. So you may have had that also in your custom development, that your customers wanted to attach documents to objects which are actually custom-owned. And they want to keep track of the changes which happen there. And for both those components, or for both those responsibilities, SAP provides the knowledge provider and the NetWeaver change documents already. And we actually aim to use that. And this was much more easy than we actually expected. Because for both the components, the document management and the change documents, there is a wrapper which is provided as business object. So now you may think, hey, well, what is the advantage of that? There are basically two major advantages, or three major advantages. When you are able to include that as a business object, you can include that into your models. So like if you include the knowledge provider as technical entity, well, that's nice, you have that in your code, but with that encapsulation as a business object, you've got it in your model. So you can associate to attachments. And you can see that in your model. And you may recall that I have talked about generic interfaces, and the benefit of learning only an interface once. And this also applies to those components now. So even without knowing how to talk to the knowledge provider or how to talk to the change documents, we did not have to care about that because we had to learn only the interface of the business object. And that's it. And a kind of a side effect of that is that it is very easy to bind those elements to the UI. Because there's a Floorplan Manager BOPF integration, which speaks business objects. So if it finds a business object which encapsulates the knowledge provider, you can just add it to the UI via the Floorplan Manager BOPF integration. So adding something like change documents or attachments to your custom objects is a task of an hour. So there's only configuration to be done, so no code involved at all. Okay, this is it, what we had enhanced in iteration 3 majorly. Let's have a look at the feedback after iteration 3. This consists actually of two parts. One was the adaptation of the user interface. So this was yet another framework, the FBI with the FBI view. This is yet another entity to learn. But actually, for every technical topic, you find one or the other developer who is really getting into it, and then he's explaining that. And once you have understood how to use it, you can just apply that everywhere. So it's definitely worth learning once. And the adding of those generic components, or the NetWeaver components, to our custom application also was so much less effort that that also the consultants had a much increased confidence into our solution because these were known components and they knew how they generally work and how to customize them. So that was very convenient for the consultants and more or less customers. So that's it for my presentation. So I want to have a look at the scorecard. Okay, and as a developer, when using something, I think of interacting with an entity. So it's just like coding to an interface. Okay, so using a framework, what you get out of that method highly depends on what you put in. So depending on your input, you get a defined output. So I can tell you what was the output for my input or for our project. I can't tell you whether that applies for every of your projects. But for us, we just invested some object orientation, some eagerness to learn, some good ABAP skill, and we like to do some modeling. And this paid off a lot because we were much faster than we would have been in a traditional build from scratch or build from scratch development. We had a much higher agility because we were not disrupted by changes of the technical layers. We had much less effort, and the overall architectural quality improved a lot because we did not have islands of architecture, but we had one consistent, concise architecture which was provided there. So this is why we definitely like to do that. and why I am here to recommend that to all of you if you go for custom development to have a look at that. So that's it from my side. As I said, I've put some further information into the speaker notes. But if you've got questions now, I would be happy to try to answer them. And I would be happy for your feedback. So thanks for your attention. Ladies first.
What is the use case for using this as opposed to other technologies?
The use case is definitely whenever you are going for implementing some logic which is not part of the business suite. So whenever you've got something, some enhancements of the business suite or of some product which is provided by SAP, there are other technologies to use like BADIs or enhancement spots or whatever you got there as technology. But if you're going to build something from scratch, instead of going for another platform and good integration with the ABAP, then this is definitely worth having a look at.
I have a question for persistence. Do you have to model database or is it generated?
The question was whether you have to model the database. It's not that you model the database. You model the structure of your business object, and then a database table is generated, but the database access is done in a generic way. So it's not that BOPF generates artifacts which you address. You don't have to care about persistence anyway. You just model your business, and you model which parts of that business are to be persisted in general and which is transient information. And then BOPF generates the persistence for you. He was first. Sorry for making you run.
On one of the first slides I saw for internal use only after the BOPF transaction.
Yes.
How should I interpret that?
You can interpret that we were the first ones to use it.
Okay.
Okay, so we were the first. So it was what you have seen there on the slide. Thanks for paying attention that closely. Was the development environment which is used by SAP. There is a customer-released environment which has a reduced set of functionality, but which was not fully satisfying our needs. So we went for using the same tool which SAP uses as modeling environment. But there is more to come. I can tell you they are working on an Eclipse integration. So you've got your full choice of modeling environments. So you can go for a SAP UI-based modeling environment, or you can go for an Eclipse-based modeling environment that all boils down to the same model.
But is it already available for us?
It is.
What you used?
Yes, it is. It is available with enhancement package 6 of ECC 6. This is fully available, and enabling this modeling environment, which we've been using, is available via a note.
Did you consider using any other frameworks like SPI or what's yeah?
So why we went for particular this approach? So one is that I've been with SAP before I went outside to the customer side. So I knew that BOPF is SAP internally. It's the architecture to use for new developments. So whenever SAP is providing a new component on ABAP, they will go for that same architectural approach. So this is why we thought of having that, using the same architecture, because we knew it was future-proof and is also being consistently enhanced and maintained. So we also had a look at SPI, or we also had a look at Genil-Boll and all that. But this was just the most coherent set of functionality which we have found, which provides a generic full stack with all the necessary points of enhancements which we wanted. So your question is about how it is to do disruptive changes.
And what about the generated code? I'm not a big fan of SAP generated code.
Yes, there is no generated code in BOPF. So all that code is generic. It's not generated, it's generic, so it's not typed. So BOPF.
But SAP still generates the persistence underneath.
It generates a database table, but it does not generate any code. That's the difference.
So how does it access the database table it generates?
Generically, dynamic programming. Okay, but your question actually was, how about disruptive changes? So if you, for example, move some attributes from one entity to another one, okay? Or move it, delete it, whatever, decide not to use it anymore, then, of course, you have to adapt the layers which are consuming that, okay? But there is, of course, the way used, which you can use in order to find your places where you've been using that. And other than that, it's much more easy to remove it from a configuration than to remove it from code. So of course you have to, if you remove something, it is not getting removed throughout the whole stack. But it's much less effort than if you remove it from code. At least from my experience. Did that satisfy your question? Yes, so if you remove it, so the question was about moving something from one database table to another one. So of course, if you just remove it from one table, then you will lose your content. So what you do usually is that you add that in that target entity and move your logic to the target entity, implement your report, which is transporting that data, and then remove it. But as you are always mapping that, that is quite easy.
What was your source of information on how to use these tools?
Well, I've been with SAP for some years, so I knew those tools.
Me neither.
Okay, but after SAP has decided to allow a general use of those tools, they have also provided some development guides. They have started to, in an SCN space, to publish some information on SCN. So for all those layers, also for the Floorplan Manager BOPF integration, there are development tutorials. And there's also a course in Walldorf, a 2 days introductory course, which has been installed. So we were actually quite bound to the personal knowledge and getting in touch with the development team of SAP. So we had first-hand contact. This was very comfortable, of course. But now they have started to provide more information, and they will surely provide more if you ask that on SCN.
I was just wondering, if you do a development without those tools, a larger development, you will in the end have a lot of objects needing maintenance, all kind of reports, etc. Anybody knows. At the end of your project, do you then have one huge model or multiple models?
That depends on what you define as model. So there's only one reality. Okay, there's only one reality. So there's also one model. But for each business object, there's one dedicated atomic model. And for each part of each business object, there's also a model with respect to that particular node, which is the entity which carries the logic. So you've got just like you think of a UML diagram. Okay, if you think of a UML class diagram, you also have one model, which is the diagram. But it has multiple entities. And just like that, we also have one component, which has multiple business objects with multiple entities for logic attached. So it's very modularized. Did that answer your question? Okay. There's another one in the back, I think.
Is the framework provides us a real business service layer? I mean that can I attach any UI what I want?
Sure.
So it's a real service layer for REST service or mobile applications. So what I want is not normal, not ABAP GUI based application.
Of course, you can bind any UI technology to that. It's just that the Floorplan Manager BOPF integration is the most convenient one to use. So if you are going to use the SAP UI on base of your model, you just have to code more. That's it. So there's not a big support.
No, for me, the question is that the business logic resides inside of the core domain, so it's not outside linked to the UI.
No, it resides fully inside the model.
Okay.
So also, for example, there is a service for retrieving the readability and changeability of fields. Okay? So this you can implement in your model, and then your UI just has to retrieve that information and interpret that information. And the Floorplan Manager BOPF integration does that generically. So there's no code involved. That's the benefit. But if you need to do that on SAP UI, that's not a problem. Or it's, of course, a problem to implement SAP UI, but that's the usual problem of implementing SAP UI. And I can tell you that there will also be, with 740, there's also an OData provider for BOPF models. So you can also access that via OData and then have any look at some funky UI5 session here. But if you do that, please let me know on SCN, because I want to have a look at that.
Okay, thanks.
Can it also be used to classic Dynpro programming?
Yes, definitely. That was, I think it's a similar question.
Yeah, but it's still with the integration to the Floorplan Manager.
No, it's totally, the business logic layer is totally agnostic to any UI technology. So you can, so that modeling environment, which you have seen, where that was written for internal use only, okay? This is also a SAP UI, and it also attaches to a model, because BOPF runs BOPF, so the BOPF meta model is also modeled in BOPF. So you've already got a sample of how to connect to a BOPF model with the BOPF, which has all that modeling environment as SAP UI. So that is not a problem.
Within the BOPF, can I implement business objects that actually lie not within the SAP stack, but somewhere else? For example, within my modeler, it could be nice to model somewhere from the outside world,
yes,
and I've got a nice online interface, but it's not an SAP database.
Yes, of course you can do that. So it's a framework. So every part of that framework is exchangeable in theory. I don't know how far this is going to be released, but what you were talking about is actually exchanging the database access. So what you could do is you can implement a database access class, which connects to some web service, remote procedure call, whatever you think. And then you can take advantage of all the programming model, and you can also take advantage of all the services which are above the database layer, like buffering, transaction handling, edit mode handling, all that. You get it for free if you just attach another persistence. But this is really funky programming then. You can, no, I will not say something about that. I promised 1 hour without HANA, so I will not say something about HANA. Okay. Any other question? No? Then thanks for all of the questions. Thanks for all your attendance. And I would be happy to read you on SCN or get in touch with me directly. I'm running around here. Okay, thank you.